It didn't need a pilot. It made its own decision to kill. On March the 16th, 2026, in the middle of a bright Kyiv morning, air raid sirens tore through the capital. Interceptor batteries opened fire on wave after wave of incoming drones. And when the smoke cleared over Independence Square, investigators found something that should not have been possible. A strike drone whose targeting decisions, evidence suggests, may not have been made by a human being at all. Ukrainian intelligence would later confirm what defense analysts had feared for months. Russia is fitting its most widely used strike drone with artificial intelligence, built in part from Western components, designed to hunt without a human hand on the controls. This is the story of how that happened, why it's happening now, and why it may be the moment the war in Europe quietly changes shape forever. If you want to understand the wars actually shaping our future, not just the headlines, subscribe now. It began with a sound Kyiv residents had learned, painfully to recognize. The low buzzing drone of an engine that did not belong to any bird, followed by silence, followed by an explosion. But March the 16th, 2026 was different. It was daytime. Explosions rang out across the Ukrainian capital in broad daylight, an unusual hour for this kind of assault. And air defense units were caught fighting off a barrage of drones under the full gaze of witnesses, journalists, and cameras. When one piece of wreckage came to rest at the foot of the Independence Monument in the very heart of the city, it looked, at first, like just another fragment of just another drone. It was not. Ukrainian military intelligence would soon identify it as a Lancet, Russia's signature loitering munition, and they would say something that should unsettle anyone paying attention to how modern wars are actually fought. This Lancet, they suggested, may have been operating with a level of autonomy Russia had never before deployed at this scale. Somewhere inside that wreckage was evidence pointing toward artificial intelligence, technology built in part around processing boards manufactured by an American company, repurposed for war. To understand why that single piece of debris matters more than almost anything else happening in this conflict right now, you need to understand what the Lancet actually is, why it has already reshaped this war once, and why teaching it to think for itself could reshape it again. The Lancet is not a missile in the traditional sense, and it is not simply another exploding drone lobbed indiscriminately at a city. It is something more specific, and in some ways more dangerous. A loitering munition, sometimes called a kamikaze drone, built by Russia's Zala Aero Group, a subsidiary of the Kalashnikov conglomerate. Unlike the larger Shahed drones, Russia has imported and adapted from Iran, which behave essentially like slow cruise missiles, carrying a large warhead toward a fixed target. The Lancet was designed to do something closer to hunting. It loiters. It circles over a suspected target area, searching, waiting, until it identifies a specific high-value target, an artillery piece, a radar system, an air defense launcher, a parked armored vehicle, and only then does it commit to the strike. That distinction matters enormously because it changes what the weapon is actually for. A cruise missile is built to destroy a location. A loitering munition is built to destroy an opportunity, wherever and whenever that opportunity appears. And for a war defined, on the Ukrainian side, by expensive Western-supplied artillery and air defense systems, that made the Lancet one of the most cost-effective weapons Russia has ever fielded. At roughly $35,000 per unit, a single Lancet is proven capable of destroying equipment worth many multiples of that price, sometimes 100 times more. That is not just a tactical detail. That is a complete inversion of the economics that have shaped modern warfare for the last 70 years, in which the expensive, sophisticated side was assumed to hold the advantage. Here, cheap and disposable is beating expensive and precious simply by being persistent, numerous, and increasingly hard to stop. So ask the first strategic question this documentary keeps returning to: why now? Why, 4 years into a grinding war of attrition, is Russia investing scarce engineering talent and smuggled components into making its cheapest weapons smarter rather than simply making more of them? The answer lies in a problem Russia has been quietly losing to for the better part of a year. Ukraine's air defenses have been getting harder to penetrate, not easier. Military analysts monitoring the war closely have suggested that Russia likely shifted concentrated Lancet strikes toward Kyiv precisely because more conventional approaches were failing to punch through. If your weapon can no longer count on hitting a target through sheer force or numbers alone, the next lever you can pull is precision, teaching the weapon itself to find, identify, and lock onto a target without relying on a fragile, jammable link back to a human operator. That is the strategic logic behind fitting a Lancet with autonomous targeting. It is not a science fiction leap. It is a survival adaptation, a response to Ukraine's improving ability to detect, jam, and shoot down remotely piloted systems. Here is what has been documented, and here is where the confidence levels genuinely matter, because this is exactly the kind of story that gets exaggerated in both directions online. It is a verified fact that a Lancet-type drone struck central Kyiv on March the 16th. It is a verified fact that debris was recovered and analyzed by Ukraine's Defense Intelligence Directorate. It is a high-confidence assessment, based on that analysis, that the drone had undergone significant modernization compared to earlier Lancet variants. It is also a high-confidence assessment, stated directly by Ukrainian intelligence, that Russia is testing artificial intelligence modules on its Lancet fleet, built around processing hardware associated with an American company's commercial AI computing boards, and that this work appears to be happening in cooperation with Iran, which has its own long history of supplying Russia with Shahed series drone technology. What remains a moderate confidence assessment, still debated among analysts and officials, is precisely how autonomous the March 16th strike itself actually was. Some Ukrainian officials pushed back publicly on early claims that this specific drone represented a fully autonomous AI-guided strike, even as the broader trend toward autonomy in Russia's drone program is not seriously disputed. That distinction matters. It would be irresponsible to tell you that a fully self-thinking killer robot struck Kyiv that day. It is entirely responsible to tell you that Russia is actively building toward that capability, has already fielded components associated with it, and is doing so faster than most Western publics realize. Now here's the detail that should genuinely trouble anyone who has spent the last 4 years believing that sanctions were successfully strangling Russia's access to advanced technology. When Ukrainian intelligence tore down the recovered drone components, they identified 62 distinct electronic parts inside the Lancet and its lesser-known cousin, the scalpel. The overwhelming majority of those components were not Russian-made at all. They trace back primarily to the United States, Switzerland, and China. This is not a new phenomenon in this war. Ukrainian and Western investigators have spent years documenting Western semiconductors, sensors, and processors turning up inside Russian missiles and drones, arriving through third countries, shell companies, and gray market resellers, despite export controls specifically designed to prevent exactly this outcome. But the presence of a modern commercial AI computing board inside a weapon actively used to strike a European capital city is a different order of problem. It suggests that whatever friction sanctions have created, they have not been sufficient to prevent state-level defense industries from acquiring cutting-edge computing hardware when the underlying commercial supply chains for that hardware are, by design, globally distributed and difficult to fully seal. What this reveals, at the level of intelligence analysis, is not that sanctions have failed entirely. Production costs for Russia have almost certainly risen, and certain categories of components have become harder to source, but that a purely defensive, list-based sanction strategy struggles against an adversary with 4 years of practice building parallel supply networks through intermediaries. Now widen the lens beyond a single drone and a single strike, because the more consequential story here is not about one weapon. It is about doctrine and about what happens to an entire military philosophy when weapons like this exist in large numbers. For most of the 20th century, and for the opening phase of this war, offensive operations still depended fundamentally on combined arms, infantry, armor, and artillery, moving and supporting each other, with air power and now drones playing a supporting, if increasingly important, role. What loitering munitions like the Lancet, deployed at scale, are quietly doing is inverting parts of that hierarchy. When a single $35,000 drone can reliably find and destroy a multi-million-dollar tank or a critical air defense radar, the calculus of concentrating expensive armored formations in the open becomes far riskier than it was even 5 years ago. Analysts studying this war closely have noted that Russia has begun deploying Lancets in coordinated small groups, 2 or 3 drones sent simultaneously against a single target, specifically designed to overwhelm the countermeasures and attention of whoever is defending that position. That is a meaningfully different concept from a single drone hunting alone. It is the early architecture of what military planners call swarm tactics. Not necessarily dozens of drones acting as one intelligent hive mind just yet, but enough coordinated autonomy that a handful of cheap weapons can defeat defenses built to handle a single incoming threat at a time. European armies that spent decades building doctrine around armored maneuver warfare are now confronting a battlefield where an armored column's greatest vulnerability may not be enemy tanks or artillery at all, but a hidden operator or increasingly an algorithm patiently waiting in the sky above. There is a deeper technical shift here too, one that deserves its own moment of attention because it is easy to miss amid the drama of a strike on a capital city. Reports from analysts tracking Russian drone development suggest the country is working on longer endurance Lancet variants capable of loitering for over an hour, extending how long these weapons can linger over contested territory hunting for targets. There are also indications Russia has been testing synthetic aperture radar seekers on some variants, sensors that can identify targets through cloud cover, smoke, or darkness, independent of a clear optical view. And separately, across the wider war, both sides have increasingly turned to fiber-optic controlled drones, connected to their operators by a literal spool of cable rather than a radio signal, specifically because these systems are far more resistant to electronic warfare jamming than anything relying on wireless communication. Put those three threads together: extended loiter time, all-weather sensing, and physical resistance to jamming, and you can see the outline of where this technology is heading, regardless of how quickly the fully autonomous AI targeting matures. Even before a drone needs to think entirely for itself, it is becoming steadily harder to blind, harder to sever from its target, and harder to simply wait out. This is where Europe's response comes into focus, and where the second half of this story gets considerably more hopeful, if still uncertain. NATO has not been passive in the face of this shift, even if public awareness of its response has lagged behind the pace of the threat. In March of 2026, the alliance ran its first major counter-drone testing campaign at a dedicated innovation range in Latvia, gathering defense industry players, military units, and government officials to trial high-speed interceptors, electronic warfare systems, and layered air defense solutions under realistic conditions, explicitly designed to address urgent battlefield lessons pulled directly from Ukraine. That was followed by preparations for an even larger multinational exercise in Estonia, sometimes referred to by the codename Silent Swarm, specifically built to rehearse defenses against coordinated autonomous drone attacks and to test how manned and unmanned systems can operate together under contested electronic conditions. Estonia's choice as a host is not incidental. The country brings serious cyber defense expertise through its long-standing cooperative cyber defense center, and staging a major drone swarm defense exercise on NATO's eastern flank sends a deliberate signal of deterrence toward Moscow, while also placing the rehearsal as close as realistically possible to where such a scenario might actually occur. Money has followed doctrine. At a recent summit, NATO unveiled what officials have called a drone edge initiative, committing more than $40 billion over the coming 5 years, specifically toward counter-drone systems and toward expanding the alliance's own drone operator training, with an ambition to increase that training capacity roughly 5-fold before the end of the decade. That scale of investment tells you something important in itself. Using the intelligence analyst's core question, what does this reveal? It reveals that NATO's leadership has concluded at the highest levels that this is not a temporary battlefield curiosity confined to Ukraine, but a fundamental and lasting shift in how future conflicts, including a potential future conflict directly involving NATO territory, would actually be fought. Separately, several NATO states have moved to deploy counter-drone systems explicitly designed to keep functioning under electronic warfare conditions that would disable more conventional air defense radar, following incidents such as Poland scrambling fighter jets to intercept roughly 20 Russian drones that penetrated its airspace during strikes on Ukraine last autumn. A stark, uncomfortable reminder that the line between a war in Ukraine and a war touching NATO soil has already become thinner than most European publics would like to believe. And that thinning line deserves its own honest examination, because not every drone crossing into NATO airspace this year has been a deliberate Russian provocation, and collapsing that nuance would do a disservice to an accurate understanding of the war. This spring, a series of drone incursions into Baltic airspace over Finland, Latvia, and Estonia were traced not to a Russian attack on NATO territory directly, but to the unintended spillover of Ukraine's own expanding deep strike campaign against Russian military-industrial targets. Drones, whose satellite navigation and telemetry links were severed by Russian electronic warfare, sending them drifting off course into neighboring airspace rather than deliberately targeting it. Ukraine's government formally acknowledged these incidents and apologized to the affected states, and has since committed technical experts to help Baltic allies build better preventative detection measures. This detail matters for red-teaming our own conclusions here. It would be tempting and dramatic to frame every drone crossing into NATO skies as an act of Russian aggression against the alliance. The more accurate and in some ways more unsettling picture is that modern drone warfare is now creating unintended escalation risk almost as a side effect of its own scale and electronic complexity. A reminder that in this new era, miscalculation may not require malicious intent at all, only enough drones flying at once. Meanwhile, Russia has continued demonstrating the sheer industrial scale it can bring to bear. In one documented barrage this spring, Russia launched over 1,500 drones across a single 48-hour period, the largest recorded single assault of the entire war, striking targets across 14 Ukrainian regions simultaneously, railway infrastructure, port facilities, and energy installations among them. Notably, Ukraine's own air defenses reportedly achieved a confirmed intercept rate above 97% during the peak of that assault, a genuinely remarkable figure that should temper any narrative suggesting Ukraine's defenses are simply being overwhelmed. This is the tension that defines the current moment, and it is worth sitting with rather than resolving too quickly in either direction. Russia is producing drones at an industrial scale that Western manufacturing bases still struggle to match, reportedly millions of unmanned systems annually across its various programs. And yet Ukraine, with far more constrained resources, continues adapting fast enough to intercept the overwhelming majority of what is thrown at it, developing its own countermeasures, including small, purpose-built interceptor drones designed simply to physically collide with incoming Lancets before they reach their targets. An approach that faces its own brutal economic constraint, since an interceptor drone genuinely needs to cost meaningfully less than the $35,000 weapon it is trying to stop, or the economics of defense collapse all over again in the opposite direction. So where does this actually leave us, and where might it be heading over the next several years? Let's walk through this the way an intelligence assessment should, not as a single confident prediction, but as a set of scenarios, weighted by plausibility rather than certainty. In the best case for European and Ukrainian security, autonomous targeting technology proves harder to scale reliably than Russia's public claims suggest, remaining confined to a small number of demonstration strikes rather than becoming a mass-produced capability, while NATO's $40 billion counter-drone investment matures quickly enough to blunt whatever autonomous capability does emerge, restoring a rough technological balance within the next 2 to 3 years. In the most likely scenario, based on the trajectory we have traced throughout this analysis, autonomous and semi-autonomous targeting spreads gradually rather than suddenly, appearing first in small numbers on Russia's most advanced Lancet variants, refined through continuous battlefield testing against Ukrainian defenses, while NATO's countermeasures improve in parallel but remain perpetually one adaptation cycle behind, producing a rolling technological arms race rather than a decisive breakthrough for either side, not unlike the back-and-forth escalation between armor and anti-tank weapons that defined mid-20th century land warfare. In the worst case, the components and expertise behind this technology proliferate beyond Russia and Ukraine entirely, flowing, as some of this documented cooperation already suggests, toward Iran and its regional proxy networks, or toward other state and non-state actors observing this war closely, transforming autonomous loitering munitions from a Russia-Ukraine battlefield problem into a genuinely global proliferation crisis within a matter of a few years. And the wildcard scenario, the one intelligence analysts are trained never to dismiss simply because it seems unlikely, involves a serious miscalculation arising not from deliberate escalation, but from exactly the kind of unintended airspace incursion we've already seen occur this spring. A drone, whether Russian or Ukrainian in origin, autonomous or simply lost, triggering a NATO response that neither side actually intended, in a security environment where the margin for error is shrinking precisely as the machines making split-second targeting decisions become less human. It is worth pausing on the historical comparisons that inevitably get reached for in moments like this, because they illuminate something real, while also risking real distortion if taken too literally. Some have compared this moment to the introduction of the tank in the closing years of the First World War, a machine that, almost overnight, undermined the assumptions an entire generation of military planners had built their doctrine around. That comparison holds in one important respect. Both moments represent a technology forcing armies to rapidly unlearn assumptions about how ground can be held and armor can be massed. But the comparison breaks down in a crucial way too. The tank was a slow, visible, singular battlefield actor whose limitations became apparent over years of trial and adaptation. What we are watching now is a technology that is cheap, disposable, increasingly autonomous, and capable of being manufactured and iterated at a pace measured in months, not years. A fundamentally faster adaptation cycle than anything 20th century military planners ever had to contend with. That acceleration, more than the autonomy itself, may end up being the more historically significant feature of this entire moment. There is also, underneath all of the strategic and technical analysis, a human dimension that is easy to lose amid discussion of processing boards and intercept rates. For the residents of Kyiv and of cities across Ukraine, this is not an abstract arms race playing out in a defense ministry briefing room. It is the difference between a drone that might, at least in theory, be jammed or spoofed by disrupting its communication link to a distant human operator, and a weapon that no longer needs that link at all, one that has already made its targeting decision before anyone on the ground even knows it is there. And for policymakers across NATO's eastern flank, from Warsaw to Tallinn to Helsinki, this is no longer a hypothetical either. It is a set of drone fragments already turning up in fields and forests well inside their own borders, evidence not of a future war, but of how blurred the edges of the current one have already become. What all of this ultimately reveals, at the level of strategic thinking rather than tactical detail, is a Russia that is under genuine pressure to innovate precisely because its brute force approach to this war has been increasingly blunted by Ukrainian adaptation, and a West that is only now, 4 years in, beginning to treat drone and counter-drone technology with the institutional seriousness and funding scale that a war of this duration and consequence actually demands. Neither side holds a permanent advantage here. What we are witnessing instead is one of the fastest-moving technological competitions in the modern history of warfare, playing out in real time, with consequences that are no longer confined to the battlefields of eastern Ukraine. So here's the question worth carrying with you over the next 24 to 72 hours, as new reporting on this story almost certainly continues to emerge. If the next drone recovered from a strike in Kyiv or somewhere else entirely is confirmed beyond doubt to have made its own targeting decision without any human being involved in that final choice, what happens next? Not just on the battlefield, but to the legal, moral, and political frameworks the world has spent decades building around the idea that a human being must always be the one who decides to take a life.